Hello. Donald Trump is reported to be considering an extension to his deadline on March the 1st for imposing tougher tariffs on Chinese exports. So does this imply that high-level talks currently taking place in Beijing are looking positive? And a newly released survey lists the U.S. as top of the security concerns of people in 26 countries around the world. So what is behind their concerns? Welcome to The Point. I'm Zhou, sitting in for Liu Xin. Bloomberg reports that U.S. President Donald Trump is weighing up whether to add 60 days to his current deadline of imposing tariffs, additional tariffs on Chinese imports in order to give Sino-U.S. trade negotiations more time. Well, the news came as U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer and U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin are now in Beijing having talks with the Chinese counterparts led by Chinese Vice Premier Liu He. Well, Trump on Tuesday said that he could allow the March 1st tariff deadline to slide for a little while if the two countries are close to a trade deal. And on Wednesday, he said trade talks with China are going along very well. So, is this a turnaround for the trade dispute between the world's two largest economies? And does this suggest a trade deal is just around the corner? And what next? Joining our discussions in Beijing is Thye Wu, Professor of Economics at the University of California, Davis, who is also Academic Advisor to the Center for China and Globalization, and Mr. Gong, Professor of Economics at the University of International Business and Economics. And in Taipei, we have Ross Feingold, Asia Political Risk Analyst and former Asia Chairman of Republicans Abroad. Welcome, gentlemen. Let me start with you, John. Trump seems to be flip-flopping a lot, but this time is a headline-making news because he wants to extend the trade talks, which has been stalled for so long, for another 60 days. Is that a good news?
I think so. First of all, he calls it a little while. 60 days is not a little while. It's quite some time. But I think overall it's good news. I don't think that he would be considering this if there's no progress made during the current round of negotiations. Something is going on. I think he's making this indication, I think, for two reasons. One is that probably the negotiation team still needs some more time. They're talking about a very complicated deal here. And I think the report says that essentially, especially they're talking about enforcement mechanisms, and this is a very complicated process, and they probably need more details to work out things. And the second reason, I think, is he's probably talking about a summit between him and President Xi. I think, he very much likes to have a meeting like that, such that he can personally claim a victory. There are certain issues on that list of 140 some items that are still needs to be worked out. Most of the items will be addressed by the two negotiating teams, and there are a few issues here that may be personally worked out by these two people.
So two things, Professor Wu, I want your take on this. Is it because Trump wants to meet Xi and then sign a deal, or because they really need more time, Lighthizer and Mnuchin, to figure out how to have a deal?
I think given the ambitiousness of the administration's agenda for trade reform, I think there are at least 5 areas, and these 5 areas are areas that require a lot of details to be spelled out. And I think 60 days, in my opinion, may not be enough.
So you think there are going to be another extension?
If there's no extension, that means that we are making very fast progress on 5 important issues.
But is it possible, do you think it is possible to have agreement on those 5 important areas, namely?
Well, the first one would be, the first one that's quite easy to do is
trade imbalance.
No, I don't think a trade imbalance is the driving force.
What are the 5 things you mentioned?
I think the first thing is that the Chinese were to start implementing some much delayed components of the 1999 US-China agreement on WTO accession. Like, for example, giving access to US telecommunications company, allowing greater access to the to Chinese financial services, like the setting up of banks and the the entry of visa into payments processing, which are supposed to have occurred 5 years after that agreement. That hasn't shown much progress. So the first one is catching up with the past. And I think that's the easy one, because China agreed to do it. The second one, which I think is also easy and which China does not have to worry very much, is that they want China to pay a much higher price for the high tech that it buys from the US.
Transfer of technology.
Transfer of technology.
What is the hardest one?
I think the hardest one would be to get China to reduce its use of the WTO privileges which China is entitled to.
What is that?
Because it's a developing country, China is entitled to use tariffs and subsidies to promote industries.
Industrial
and I
policy.
think that, yes,
Industrial policy.
China is entitled to it under WTO rules as a developing country.
So your opinion is that it is very complicated. It takes more than 60 days, probably 6 years to finish all those talks.
Oh, I don't think you need 6 years, because I think that would be the end of the system.
I want your take on this, John.
I think the American farmers can't afford waiting anymore. I mean, there are already farmers going bankrupt. We're seeing the senators from those Midwest agricultural states can't wait anymore. I mean, they can't afford waiting anymore. I think this thing can be keep on going like this. We're already seeing the January exports figures are coming down between the United States and China. People are holding back their orders, waiting for a solution, a final solution to this dispute. So I think we better close this very quickly. I think from both sides. I think President Trump needs a political win here. He can't afford prolonging this for too long. And the same thing on our side as well.
And Ross, I want your take on this. Who do you think has more reasons to make compromises and reach a deal at this particular point? Is it 60 days serious?
Well, for President Trump, he still has a very strong domestic U.S. economy. The GDP growth numbers, the employment numbers are all still looking very positive. It also looks likely that there will be an agreement on appropriations and that there's not going to be another government shutdown in the United States. So President Trump has a lot of positives going for him domestically, which actually gives him good reason not to rush into an agreement with China and perhaps hold out for additional things that the United States negotiators are seeking through this process. So we also have to look at it through the angle, or from the angle,
but you don't,
of U.S.
you don't believe that
politics.
He needs a diplomatic win.
Some of those factors are not necessarily related to the trade. Well, the interesting thing about some of these issues is, even if it hurts some of the constituencies in the United States, like the farmers that the other guests were discussing, in actuality, these voters, according to most polls, they still overwhelmingly support Donald Trump, even if they've been personally hurt by
But how long can they endure
tariffs.
the short-term pain? It's going to be a long-term pain. What about it turns out to be there for another year or 2 years?
Well, that's also a very interesting point, because once we start talking about 1 to 2 years, we are into the next United States presidential election campaign season. So by being what President Trump believes and his team believes is tough and insisting on a better deal, and then being able to declare a victory as the election season gets closer or when it begins, again, that actually works in President Trump's favor from a domestic U.S. political perspective.
Yeah, John?
Yeah, I totally disagree. I mean, all the things this guest mentioned were there when President Xi and President Donald Trump met in Argentina. These things haven't changed a bit. And why would he set up a date, March 1st? That's the date the American side sets. And why would he do that? And he sets a date and then breaks it intentionally? I don't buy this argument. I think that there's a real reason that needs some time for negotiation, and there's a time to set up a presidential summit between these two people.
Let's be more specific about the priorities that Mr. Wu mentioned. In what areas that China will make compromises, and in what areas probably they will stay where they are?
Well, I think from the Americans' perspective, of course, the trade deficit is the primary concern, and that's an easy issue. I think can be resolved very quickly. And I think from the other structural problems, I think on their priority list are things with respect to intellectual property protection, forced technology transfer, and stop of so-called theft of intellectual properties, especially on the network. So these things, I think, they're primary concerns. And I think
those things are achievable.
And these things are very easy for the Chinese side to make some concessions. I think these are the things that indeed are in our own interest, actually. Not much of a big concern from our side.
What about the industrial policies?
Right, that I agree. Industrial policy is a little bit difficult. I think subsidies, for example, also a little bit difficult. But even for these issues, I'm still convinced that even so-called concessions made on our side are not going to cut really into our fundamental interests here in the long run.
I don't think Trump faces any danger of losing the farm votes. I think farmers vote for Trump for a number of different reasons. One of them is he appeals to their cultural conservatism, and he appeals to their nationalism of, yes, it's too bad you have to pay the price, but think of the country at large. And I think he has been able to play the card pretty well.
And the farmers are his base, actually.
He can afford, because they're so loyal, he can afford to let them suffer.
Okay. Ross, very short question. Do you think President Trump will meet President Xi before they have a final deal?
It's certainly something that President Trump has indicated he wants to do. And we should be fair both to President Trump and President Xi. When they have met in person, whether it was at Mar-a-Lago way back in the spring of 2017 or more recently in Argentina, those meetings seem to go very well. They seem to get along well. There always is a positive result from these meetings. Both leaders say good things about the other. They say good things about the other country. And it seems, at least in the weeks or the most immediate time period after these meetings, the two countries do have talks. They do make some progress, although unfortunately over time we see that these talks have not necessarily led to a result. But the immediate period after these meetings, there is a lot of positive momentum. So I think it works to both leaders' advantage to have that meeting.
So when they finally meet, if in March, April, or May, that means a deal is already made?
I think they will be close to a deal, and I think that they are also close to saying that as a normal practice from now onwards, the United States will handle its trade disputes with China directly rather than through the WTO mediation mechanism.
And do you think this will set an example or precedent for future trade negotiations between
basically,
big
yes,
powers?
That's what it will represent, a weakening of the bargaining power of the smallest countries. That's for sure. And it also, for them, is very important that this would set the tone for disputes in technological competition with Japan and Korea as well. Rather than going through the WTO system, which takes so long, such that when the ruling comes out against that country has already achieved maturity in the industry that it was protecting. So the WTO system gives too much time for the offenders' industries to grow up.
But
and
we
so
still need a multilateral framework to talk about whether
this is an undermining of the multilateral system. Unless the multilateral system can shorten the time involved in the mediation of trade disputes.
Okay, thank you very much. We're running out of time. Thank you very much. That's Professor Thye Wu of Economics from the University of California, and John Gong, Professor of Economics from the International Business and Economics University, and Ross Feingold, Asia Political Risk Analyst and former Asia Chairman of Republicans Abroad. We'll take a short break, and we'll be back with more, looking at the newly released survey, which lists the U.S. as one of the largest security concerns around the world.